The warehouse echoed with its usual chaos, clanging machinery, shouting voices, and the relentless hum of conveyor belts. Miles Bennett, a senior warehouse worker, was stacking crates when the loud slam of a door startled him. In walked Anya Stevens, a petite woman on crutches, her face tense with determination. She struggled with a large package, every movement a battle against gravity and her prosthetic leg. Before anyone else could react, Miles stepped forward.
"Don't touch that package, Miles."
The sharp bark came from Reed Carter, the supervisor, his voice cutting through the room.
"We're not here to play hero."
Miles hesitated, the weight of Reed's words hanging in the air. But then he saw the look on Anya's face, a mixture of embarrassment and helplessness. Without a word, he ignored the supervisor's glare and reached for the package. The decision was simple. The consequences were not. The next thing Miles knew, he was sitting in Reed's office, facing a choice that would change everything.
"I don't pay you to care, Bennett."
Reed hissed.
"Do it again, and you're out."
Miles's refusal to look away from someone in need seemed small at the moment, but it set off a chain reaction no one could have foreseen. This was the spark that would ignite a revolution, a battle between kindness and corporate coldness that would ripple far beyond the warehouse walls. Have you ever wondered how far a single act of kindness could take you? Imagine being in Miles's shoes, standing at a crossroads where helping someone means risking everything. What would you do? Here's a challenge for you. Think about a time when you had to make a tough choice for someone else's sake. Would you make the same decision again? Let us know in the comments your stories could inspire others. And here's the twist. This isn't just a story, it's a conversation. Join our community by hitting subscribe and becoming part of a movement that celebrates compassion. Stay with us, because what happens next will challenge everything you think you know about kindness, courage, and standing up for what's right. This is a story you won't forget. The clamor of the warehouse filled the air like a never-ending symphony of industrial efficiency. Machines hummed, forklifts beeped incessantly, and crates thudded onto steel pallets in an unrelenting rhythm. This was life at the National Shipping Company, a sprawling logistics hub in Oak Brook, Illinois. For its workers, the days were long, the expectations high, and the rewards minimal. Miles Bennett stood in the middle of it all, a steady figure amid the chaos. His broad shoulders bore the weight of 5 years in the warehouse, his faded navy uniform clinging to his frame from the morning's sweat. Miles moved with practiced ease, lifting boxes and stacking crates with the precision of someone who knew the job inside out. Yet, despite his quiet competence, there was something about Miles that set him apart: his unfailing kindness. He had just finished securing a pallet when Bethany Collins appeared beside him, huffing as she struggled with a teetering stack of packages. "Miles, can you give me a hand before this topples over and takes me with it?" Miles grinned. "You'd think after 3 years, you'd master the art of stacking, Beth." "Ha ha ha," she said, rolling her eyes. "Some of us aren't box whisperers like you." In 2 swift motions, Miles steadied the wobbling stack and redistributed the weight. "There, now it won't crush you. I'm not covering for you if you get flattened, though." Bethany smirked. "Good to know chivalry is alive and well. Thanks, Miles." As she wheeled her cart away, Miles turned to find Reed Carter, the warehouse supervisor, standing a few feet away. Reed's thin face was set in a disapproving scowl, his clipboard clutched tightly in one hand. He glanced at the packages Bethany had been struggling with, then back at Miles. "Bennett," Reed said, his tone clipped. "You've got Station 3 falling behind, and you're over here playing Good Samaritan?" "I was just helping Beth out," Miles replied, keeping his tone calm. "She was..." "Not your problem," Reed interrupted. "We don't pay you to hold people's hands. Get back to your station before you throw off the schedule." Miles clenched his jaw but nodded. "Yes, sir." Reed lingered a moment longer, his eyes narrowing as if daring Miles to push back. When he finally walked away, Miles exhaled, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. He knew better than to argue. Reed Carter wasn't just a stickler for rules. He was a man who believed in absolute authority. Challenging him was a quick path to trouble. Miles pushed his cart towards Station 3, his mind already shifting to the next task, when the sound of the warehouse door opening caught his attention. Turning instinctively, he saw her. A petite woman, no taller than his shoulder, stepped through the doorway. She leaned heavily on a pair of crutches, her prosthetic leg barely visible beneath the hem of her jeans. Her auburn hair was tied back loosely, and her face was flushed with effort as she maneuvered through the crowded space. Balanced awkwardly on her arm was a large cardboard box, its weight clearly straining her balance. Miles froze for a moment, watching as she struggled toward the service desk. Around her, workers moved past without a second glance, their focus fixed on their tasks. The woman adjusted her grip on the box, her movements deliberate but clearly difficult. He knew he shouldn't get involved. Reed's warning was still fresh in his mind, and the last thing he needed was another lecture. But then the woman stumbled, her crutches slipping slightly on the polished floor, and Miles found himself moving before he even realized it. "Hey, let me help you with that," he said, appearing beside her. The woman looked up startled, her green eyes wide with surprise. "Oh, I don't want to trouble you." "No trouble at all," Miles said, already reaching for the box. "Here, I've got it." She hesitated for a moment before nodding, letting him take the package. "Thank you," she said, her voice tinged with relief. "It's heavier than I thought." Miles smiled. "Happens to the best of us. Where's this going?" "To the service desk," she replied, shifting her weight on her crutches. "I'm Anya Stevens, by the way." "Miles Bennett," he said as they began walking. "Nice to meet you." As they walked toward the service desk, Anya adjusted her crutches, her movements slow but purposeful. Miles carried the package with ease, his pace matching hers without a hint of impatience. "So," he said, breaking the silence, "what's in the box?" Anya smiled faintly. "Supplies for my business, beads, cords, tools. I run a small crafting business out of my home. Handmade jewelry, decorations, that sort of thing." "That's impressive," Miles said sincerely. "Running your own business must take a lot of work." "It does," Anya admitted, her tone light. "But after the accident, I needed something to keep me going. Crafting started as a way to stay busy, but it turned into something more. Now, it's how I pay the bills." Miles glanced at her, catching a glimpse of resilience beneath her calm exterior. "That's inspiring. I don't think I'd have the patience for something like that." Anya laughed softly. "Trust me, patience wasn't my strong suit before. The accident forced me to learn a lot of things, like how to deal with stares and questions from strangers. Most people don't know how to act around someone with a prosthetic." "I'm not most people," Miles said with a small shrug. "To me, you're just another person trying to get through the day. Everyone's got something they're dealing with." Anya looked at him, her expression softening. "Not everyone sees it that way. Thank you." As they reached the service desk, Miles set the package down carefully and turned to her. "Here you go. Anything else you need?" "No, this is more than enough," Anya said, her voice warm with gratitude. "You're a lifesaver, Miles," he smiled, "just doing what I can." From across the warehouse, the sharp voice of Reed Carter cut through the moment like a blade. "Bennett, what the hell are you doing?" Miles turned slowly, his stomach sinking. Reed was storming toward them, his face a mask of barely contained fury. "I was helping a customer," Miles said evenly as Reed stopped in front of him. "That's not your job," Reed snapped, his voice rising. "Your job is to move freight, not play hero. You're throwing off the entire workflow." Miles clenched his jaw, choosing his words carefully. "She needed help. I couldn't just ignore her." Reed stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. "You couldn't, huh? Well, let me make this clear. You're not here to decide what needs doing. You're here to follow orders. One more stunt like this, and you'll be out the door. Got it?" "Yes, sir," Miles said through gritted teeth. Reed turned to Anya, his tone no less harsh. "Next time, wait at the desk like everyone else. This isn't a charity." Anya's cheeks flushed, and she opened her mouth to respond, but Miles gently placed a hand on her arm, shaking his head. "It's fine," he said quietly, giving her a reassuring look. "Don't worry about it." Reed shot him a final glare before stalking off, barking orders at another worker as he went. The tension lingered even after he was gone. "I'm sorry about that," Miles said, turning back to Anya. "He's a bit of a hard case." Anya shook her head, her expression a mixture of embarrassment and frustration. "You don't have to apologize. He's the one who should be sorry." Miles offered her a small smile. "Maybe, but it won't change anything. Take care, Anya, and good luck with your business." "You too, Miles," she said softly, her eyes lingering on him as he walked away. Miles returned to his station, his mind swirling with conflicting emotions. He had done what felt right, but Reed's words gnawed at him. Was he really risking his job for something as simple as helping someone in need? The thought left a bitter taste in his mouth. Bethany approached him a few minutes later, her expression cautious. "What happened?" "I saw Reed storming around like he'd swallowed a hornet." "Nothing major," Miles said, his tone clipped. "Just got a lecture for helping a customer." Bethany raised an eyebrow. "You really need to watch it, Miles. You know how he is." "Yeah, I know," Miles said, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "But what am I supposed to do, Beth? Stand there and pretend I don't see someone struggling? That's not who I am." Bethany sighed. "I get it, but you've got to be smart about this. Reed's been under a lot of pressure from management lately. If he's looking for someone to blame for falling numbers, don't give him a reason to pick you." Miles nodded reluctantly. "I hear you." But even as he said the words, he knew he couldn't promise to change. Helping people wasn't just something he did. It was part of who he was, and no amount of pressure from Reed Carter was going to take that away. The next day at National Shipping Co., the atmosphere in the warehouse was as tense as ever. Miles Bennett kept his head down, focusing on his tasks, but the memory of his confrontation with Reed Carter lingered in his mind. He wasn't one to dwell on negativity, but something about Reed's coldness toward Anya had unsettled him. Miles's thoughts were interrupted when Bethany Collins appeared beside him, holding a clipboard. "Morning, hero," she said with a smirk. Miles chuckled softly. "Morning, Beth. What's the damage today?" "Station 4 is a mess," she replied. "But don't worry, Reed's on the warpath, so I'm sure you'll hear all about it soon enough." Miles sighed. Good to know some things never change. As Bethany walked away, the sound of the warehouse door opening caught his attention. He turned and saw Anya Stevens entering, her crutches tapping rhythmically against the floor. She carried a small package in one hand, her movements steady but deliberate. Miles couldn't help but smile. Despite her challenges, she carried herself with an air of quiet determination. "Bennett!" Reed's voice barked from across the room, snapping Miles out of his thoughts. "Station 3, now." Miles nodded and moved to comply, but not before giving Anya a small wave. She noticed and smiled in return, a flicker of gratitude passing between them. An hour later, during his lunch break, Miles sat in the break room, nursing a cup of coffee that was more bitter than he liked. The door creaked open, and to his surprise, Anya stepped inside, holding a small paper bag. "I hope I'm not interrupting," she said, her tone light but uncertain. Miles stood quickly, motioning her to sit. "Not at all. What brings you back here?" Anya placed the bag on the table. "I wanted to thank you for your help yesterday. Most people wouldn't have bothered." "You don't have to thank me," Miles said, waving off her words. "I just did what anyone would do." Anya smiled faintly. "Not anyone. Trust me, I've met plenty of people who look the other way. Here." She pushed the bag toward him. Miles opened it and found a small bracelet made of braided leather with a metal plate engraved with the words, "Kindness never goes to waste." "I make these," Anya explained. "It's nothing fancy, but I thought you might like it." Miles studied the bracelet for a moment, then slipped it onto his wrist. "It's perfect, thank you." Their conversation flowed easily after that. Anya shared more about her business and how crafting had become a lifeline after her accident. Miles listened intently, asking questions and offering words of encouragement. For a moment, the harsh reality of the warehouse faded, replaced by a sense of connection. Their moment of camaraderie was cut short when the break room door swung open, revealing Reed Carter. His eyes narrowed as he took in the scene. "What's going on here?" Reed demanded, his voice cold. "I was just..." Miles began, but Reed cut him off. "Bennett, your break ended 5 minutes ago," Reed snapped. "And you," he pointed at Anya. "This isn't a lounge. If you need something, go to the front desk." Anya's face flushed, but she held her ground. "I was just thanking him. Is that a problem?" "It is when it disrupts workflow," Reed shot back. "Bennett, get back to your station, now." Miles stood, his expression calm but firm. "I'm on my way." As he walked past Anya, he caught her eye and gave her a small nod. She returned the gesture, her expression a mix of gratitude and frustration. By the time Miles returned to his station, the mood in the warehouse had shifted. Word of the confrontation had spread, and his colleagues exchanged uneasy glances as he worked. Bethany approached him during a brief lull, her face etched with concern. "What happened this time?" she asked. "Reed walked in on me talking to a customer during my break," Miles said, his tone resigned. Bethany shook her head. "You've got to be more careful, Miles. He's looking for any excuse to come down on you." "I know," Miles replied. "But what am I supposed to do? Ignore people who need help?" Bethany sighed. "Number. But maybe don't let Reed catch you in the act next time." As the day wore on, Miles couldn't shake the feeling that his days at National Shipping Company were numbered. Reed's hostility had always been a source of tension, but now it felt personal. Still, he couldn't regret helping Anya. If anything, their brief connection had reminded him why he believed in doing the right thing, no matter the cost. A few days later, the warehouse buzzed with its usual rhythm of forklifts and conveyor belts, but Miles couldn't shake the weight of the previous confrontation. Reed had been watching him like a hawk, and the pressure to stay out of trouble gnawed at him. Despite it all, he carried on, knowing that bending to Reed's demands meant compromising the values he held dear. Around mid-morning, the heavy metal doors at the warehouse entrance groaned open. Miles glanced over instinctively and saw a familiar figure, Anya. She stood with a small package in her arms, her crutches tucked under her shoulders as she scanned the room. Miles hesitated, aware of Reed's piercing gaze from across the floor. He knew better than to step out of line again, but when Anya's package began to slip, his feet moved on their own. "Anya," he called, striding toward her. "Let me help." She looked up, relief flashing across her face. "Miles, I didn't expect to see you again. I'm fine, really, but..." Miles cut her off gently. "Let me take that before it falls." He reached for the package just as she adjusted her crutch, and together, they steadied it. Reed's voice echoed in Miles's mind, warning him of the consequences. But in that moment, he didn't care. As they walked to the service desk, Anya glanced at him with a sheepish smile. "You really don't have to keep helping me, you know." Miles shrugged. "It's who I am. Besides, I'd hate to see you struggle." Anya smiled softly. "Well, thank you. Again, most people wouldn't bother." "You've said that before," Miles said, chuckling. "I guess I'm not most people." They reached the desk, and Anya set her crutches aside to sign a receipt. Miles waited beside her, stealing a glance over his shoulder. Reed was nowhere in sight, yet. "You're a good guy, Miles," Anya said, breaking his thoughts. "I hope this place appreciates you." Miles laughed bitterly. "Not everyone feels that way." Before Anya could respond, the sharp click of footsteps approached from behind. Miles's heart sank as Reed's voice rang out, cold and cutting. "Bennett, my office, now." Miles followed Reed to the small, cluttered office at the back of the warehouse. The walls were lined with outdated safety posters, and a fan whirred noisily in the corner. Reed sat behind his desk, his face a mask of barely contained fury. "Do you enjoy making my life difficult?" Bethany studied him for a moment, then reached into her pocket and pulled out a small keychain, a simple, handcrafted design that looked familiar. "Anya dropped this off earlier. She said it's for you." Miles took the keychain, turning it over in his hand. The words, "Be the change," were engraved on the metal plate, and he felt a surge of emotion he couldn't quite name. "Thanks, Beth," he said quietly. "And tell Anya, thanks too." As he walked out into the cool night air, Miles knew that his choices would only get harder from here. But he also knew that no matter what, he wouldn't let Reed, or anyone else, dictate his values. The warehouse floor hummed with activity, the familiar sounds of machinery, and shouted instructions, creating a rhythm that Miles Bennett had come to know all too well. But today, every noise felt sharper, every glance from a coworker heavier. Reed Carter's ultimatum lingered in Miles's mind like a storm cloud, each word a reminder that he was walking a razor-thin line. Miles tried to focus on his tasks, lifting and stacking boxes with mechanical precision. But when the warehouse door swung open, the sight that greeted him made his breath catch. It was Anya Stevens again, her auburn hair glowing faintly in the sunlight that streamed through the doorway. She was balancing a large, oddly shaped package on her hip, her crutches clacking softly as she entered. Miles's first instinct was to look away, to pretend he hadn't seen her. Reed's warning echoed in his mind. One more stunt and you're gone. But then Anya shifted, the weight of the package throwing her off balance. Her crutch slipped on the polished floor, and she caught herself with a small gasp. Without thinking, Miles abandoned the box he'd been holding and strode toward her. "Let me take that," he said, his voice low but firm. Anya looked up, startled. "Miles, you don't have to." "I know," he interrupted, reaching for the package. "But I want to." She hesitated, glancing around the room. "I don't want to get you in trouble." "Too late for that," he said with a wry smile. "Come on, where's this going?" "To my car," she replied, her tone apologetic. "Thank you." Miles adjusted the package in his arms and began walking beside her, his pace matching her deliberate steps. He could feel the weight of Reed's eyes even though the supervisor was nowhere in sight. Every step felt like a gamble, but as he glanced at Anya, he knew he had made the right choice. When they reached her car, Miles set the package down carefully in the trunk. "You good from here?" he asked, straightening. Anya nodded, her expression a mixture of gratitude and guilt. "I really appreciate this. I know you're risking a lot by helping me." Miles shrugged. "It's just a box." "It's not just a box," Anya said softly. "It's a reminder that there are still good people in the world. Thank you." Before Miles could respond, the sound of heavy boots echoed across the pavement. He turned to see Reed storming toward them, his face red with anger. The warehouse supervisor looked like a man ready to explode. "Bennett!" Reed's voice was sharp enough to cut through steel. "What the hell are you doing?" Miles stepped in front of Anya, shielding her slightly. "Helping a customer," he said evenly. Reed's eyes narrowed. "That's not your job. You're paid to move freight, not play delivery boy. Get back inside." "I was just..." Miles began, but Reed cut him off. "I don't want to hear it," Reed barked. "You've been pushing your luck for weeks, and I'm done with it. You're fired." The words hit like a punch to the gut. Anya gasped behind him, and Miles felt his chest tighten. He had known this moment was a possibility, but hearing it aloud was something else entirely. "You can't be serious," Miles said, his voice low but steady. "Oh, I'm serious," Reed snapped. "Clear out your locker and leave the premises immediately." Miles stood his ground, his fists clenching at his sides. "She's a customer," he said, his voice rising slightly. "Helping her isn't against the rules." Reed took a step closer, his face inches from Miles's. "This isn't a debate, Bennett. You're done here." For a moment, the two men locked eyes, the tension thick enough to suffocate. Then Miles took a step back, exhaling slowly. He turned to Anya, offering her a faint smile. "This isn't your fault," he said softly. "Don't worry about it." "I'm so sorry," Anya whispered, her voice trembling. "This isn't fair." Miles shook his head. "It's not about fair. It's about doing what's right. Take care, Anya." Without another word, he walked back toward the warehouse, each step heavier than the last. He could feel the eyes of his co-workers on him as he passed, their expressions a mix of sympathy and unease. By the time he reached his locker, his chest felt like it was made of lead. Miles stood in front of his locker, the metal door reflecting his tired expression. The words, "You're fired," echoed in his head, each repetition hitting harder than the last. For 5 years, this warehouse had been more than just a job. It was how he supported himself, how he contributed to his community, and how he lived by his values. Losing it felt like losing a piece of himself. He opened the locker slowly, the hinges creaking, and began packing his belongings into a worn canvas bag. A small collection of items stared back at him: a thermos, a pair of gloves, and a photo of his family taken at a barbecue last summer. The sight of the picture made his throat tighten, but he pushed the emotion down. There was no time for that now. The sound of soft footsteps approached, and he turned to see Bethany Collins standing nearby. Her usually cheerful face was drawn with concern, her arms crossed tightly against her chest. "Word travels fast," Miles said with a faint, bitter smile. Bethany nodded. "Reed's been pacing like a caged animal since you left with Anya. I figured something like this was coming." She paused, lowering her voice. "This isn't right, Miles. You didn't deserve this." "It's not about deserving," Miles replied, his voice steady but weary. "It's about making a choice, and I'd make the same one again." Bethany's eyes shimmered with unshed tears. "You're a better person than most of us, you know that?" Miles chuckled dryly. "If I was better, maybe I'd have found a way to help without losing my job." Bethany shook her head. "Don't you dare start blaming yourself. You stood up for what's right, and that takes guts. Reed's the one who's wrong, not you." The door to the locker room swung open, and the low murmur of other workers filled the space. Miles turned back to his bag, stuffing the last of his things inside before slinging it over his shoulder. As he walked toward the exit, several co-workers stepped aside, their faces a mixture of admiration and sadness. "You'll be missed, Bennett," one of them said softly. "Yeah," another added. "It won't be the same without you." Miles offered a small nod, the lump in his throat making it hard to speak. He pushed through the door and into the cool evening air, letting the chill wash over him. The parking lot stretched out before him, empty save for a few lingering vehicles. Anya's car was gone, and a part of him was grateful. He wasn't sure he could face her again, not after everything that had happened. As he made his way to his own car, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, expecting a message from his sister or a spam email, but what he saw made him stop in his tracks. "Anya Stevens has tagged you in a post." Curious, he opened the notification and began reading. The post was simple but heartfelt, accompanied by a photo of the bracelet she'd given him the day before. "This is Miles Bennett," Anya had written. "He's one of the kindest people I've ever met. Today he helped me when I needed it most, even though he knew it might cost him his job." And it did. Miles was fired for showing compassion, for doing what so many of us wish more people would do: care. "I'm sharing this because people like Miles deserve better. The world needs more kindness, not less. If you agree, let him know." Beneath the post, dozens of comments were already flooding in. People shared their own stories of small acts of kindness, lamented the injustices of the corporate world, and praised Miles for his courage. A hashtag had even begun to trend: "Stand with Miles." Miles stared at the screen, his emotions a whirlwind of gratitude, embarrassment, and disbelief. He hadn't asked for any of this. He hadn't even wanted it. But the outpouring of support from strangers reminded him that maybe, just maybe, his actions had been worth it. He climbed into his car and sat there for a moment, the phone still in his hand. The weight of the day pressed down on him, but the light of Anya's post offered a small glimmer of hope. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew one thing: he wouldn't face it alone. Miles woke up to an unusual stillness in his apartment. The faint hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic outside were all that broke the silence. He sat at his kitchen table, staring at his phone, scrolling through messages and posts that seemed to have appeared overnight. The story was no longer just his. It had become something much larger. Anya had been right. Her post about his firing had reached far beyond their small community. People were sharing their own stories, moments where they had been punished for showing compassion, times when rigid rules had stifled humanity. Each one carried a piece of Miles's own struggle, and it was overwhelming. He pushed the phone aside and rested his head in his hands. It wasn't that he regretted helping Anya. He knew in his heart it was the right thing to do. But the sudden spotlight felt like a weight he wasn't sure he could carry. He didn't see himself as a hero, just someone who refused to look away when someone needed help. A knock at the door startled him from his thoughts. It was Anya, as vibrant and determined as ever, carrying her laptop under one arm and a notepad in the other. She didn't wait for an invitation, stepping inside with an energy that seemed to fill the room. "Miles," she began, her voice firm but kind. "I know this isn't easy for you, but you need to see what's happening. People are listening to your story, and they're responding." "I didn't ask for this," Miles said quietly, leaning back in his chair. "I just wanted to help you. I never wanted to start something." "I know," Anya said, sitting across from him. "But that's why it's working. People aren't following some PR campaign or a corporate slogan. They're following you because they see someone who acted on his principles, even when it cost him everything. That matters." Miles looked away, his jaw tightening. "What if I'm not the right person for this? What if I let them down?" Anya placed a hand on his arm, her expression softening. "You're not alone in this, Miles. We're doing this together. And it's not about being perfect. It's about showing people that kindness still has a place in the world." Her words stayed with him as they spent the rest of the day brainstorming ways to turn the growing interest into meaningful action. Anya's small apartment became the unofficial headquarters of their effort, with friends and neighbors stopping by to offer ideas or simply lend their support. Miles found himself reluctantly drawn into the momentum, his doubts slowly giving way to a cautious hope. The following day, Anya arranged for Miles to meet a group of local business owners who had heard about his story and wanted to help. They sat around a table at a local community center, a mix of small shop owners, nonprofit leaders, and even a retired teacher who had become an advocate for workplace fairness. Miles felt out of place at first, unsure of what he could offer to the conversation. But as the group began to share their own frustrations with how compassion was often seen as a liability, he realized his story was just one thread in a much larger tapestry. One woman, who ran a cafe downtown, spoke passionately about how her employees often went above and beyond for customers, only to be reprimanded by corporate policies. "It's like they forget we're dealing with real people," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. "They care more about numbers than the lives those numbers represent." Another man, a mechanic with grease-stained hands, nodded in agreement. "It's the same everywhere. You take a moment to help someone, and suddenly you're a problem. It's exhausting." Miles listened intently, their words resonating deeply. For the first time, he began to understand the potential of what they were building. It wasn't just about his firing, it was about challenging the culture that had made it possible. As the days passed, the pressure on National Shipping Company grew. News of Miles's firing had reached local media outlets, and reporters began showing up at the warehouse, asking questions that the company seemed unprepared to answer. Bethany, one of Miles's closest friends at work, kept him updated through hurried text messages. "They're panicking," she wrote late one night. "Reed's been called into meetings with upper management every day this week. They know they messed up." Miles read her words with a heavy heart. He hadn't wanted this to turn into a spectacle. His former co-workers didn't deserve to bear the brunt of the fallout, and he worried about the long-term consequences for the warehouse staff. But Anya's unwavering belief in the importance of their fight kept him grounded. "This isn't just about the company," she reminded him one evening as they worked late into the night. "It's about making people see that kindness isn't a weakness, it's what makes us human." Miles nodded, though he still felt the weight of it all pressing down on him. He didn't want revenge. He just wanted to remind people that doing the right thing mattered. Miles stood at the edge of the community center's makeshift conference room, his arms crossed as he listened to the animated discussions unfolding around him. The small group of business owners, activists, and local residents had grown into a vibrant coalition, each person bringing their unique perspective to the table. But for all their enthusiasm, Miles still struggled to see himself as the figurehead they wanted him to be. He felt a tug on his sleeve and turned to see Anya, her expression calm but resolute. "You need to say something, Miles," she said softly. "They're here because they believe in you." Miles hesitated. "What am I supposed to say? I'm just a guy who carried a box to someone's car." Anya smiled faintly. "That's exactly why your voice matters. You're not here to lecture them or have all the answers. Just speak from the heart." Taking a deep breath, Miles stepped forward. The conversations quieted as all eyes turned toward him. Clearing his throat, he began to speak. "I don't really know how I ended up here," he admitted, his voice low but steady. "I didn't plan for any of this. All I did was what felt right in the moment, helping someone who needed it. But I guess that's the problem, isn't it? Somewhere along the way, we've gotten used to the idea that kindness is extra, something we do when it's convenient. That's not how it should be." The room was silent, the weight of his words settling over the crowd. Emboldened, Miles continued. "I don't have all the answers, but I do know one thing. Treating people with respect and compassion isn't just the right thing to do. It's the smart thing. It builds trust, loyalty, and community. And if my story can help remind people of that, then maybe all of this has been worth it." A ripple of applause broke out, starting with Anya and spreading through the crowd. Miles's chest felt lighter as he returned to his spot by the wall, nodding at the murmured words of encouragement from those around him. For the first time, he felt like he might be able to handle the responsibility they had placed on his shoulders. Over the next week, the coalition's efforts gained traction. Anya coordinated meetings with local media outlets, crafting a narrative that centered on the universal struggle between corporate priorities and human values. Reporters interviewed Miles, capturing his quiet determination and sincerity. The coverage ignited a wave of public interest, and National Shipping Company found itself under a microscope. Inside the warehouse, tensions reached a boiling point. Bethany sent Miles a flurry of messages describing how Reed had grown increasingly erratic, snapping at employees and dodging questions from visiting executives. One morning, she sent him a photo of a hand-scrawled sign someone had taped to the break room wall. Miles was right. Despite the growing momentum, Miles remained cautious. He had seen how quickly public interest could fade, and he worried about what would happen if their efforts didn't lead to lasting change. Anya, however, was unrelenting. "This is bigger than one company," she told him one evening. "If we can show people that standing up for kindness is possible, it won't matter if national shipping changes or not. It'll inspire others to fight for the same thing." Miles nodded, though doubt still lingered in his mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was caught in a battle much larger than himself. The turning point came during a peaceful protest organized outside National Shipping's regional headquarters. What had started as a small gathering quickly grew, with hundreds of people showing up to support the cause. The crowd was a mix of local workers, small business owners, and even former employees of National Shipping, all united by a shared belief in the power of compassion. Miles stood near the edge of the crowd, watching as people held signs that read things like "Kindness is strength" and "People over profits." He hadn't wanted to speak publicly, but when the crowd began chanting his name, he realized there was no avoiding it. Anya nudged him forward, her expression both encouraging and amused. "Time to earn your spotlight, hero." Miles climbed onto a small platform someone had set up, his heart pounding as the crowd fell silent. He gripped the microphone tightly, searching for the right words. "When I was a kid," he began, "my mom used to tell me that doing the right thing wasn't always easy, but it was always worth it. I didn't really understand what she meant back then, but I think I do now. Doing the right thing means putting yourself out there, even when it feels risky. It means standing up for what you believe in, even when the odds are against you." He paused, scanning the faces in the crowd. "I didn't set out to start a movement. I just wanted to help someone. But seeing all of you here today reminds me that kindness isn't just an individual choice, it's a collective one. If we all commit to treating each other with respect and compassion, we can create workplaces, communities, and a world where everyone feels valued." The applause that followed was deafening. Miles stepped back, overwhelmed but grateful. Anya joined him on the platform, wrapping an arm around his shoulders. "That," she said, "was perfect." As the protest continued, news of the gathering began to spread. Footage of Miles's speech circulated online, drawing even more attention to their cause. By the end of the day, National Shipping Co. issued a statement acknowledging the concerns raised by employees and customers alike. They promised to review their policies and address the issues highlighted by Miles's story. Back at Anya's apartment that evening, Miles sat in silence, staring out the window as the city lights flickered in the distance. Anya joined him, setting a mug of tea on the table. "Big day," she said. "Yeah," Miles replied, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "Do you think it'll actually change anything?" Anya placed a hand on his arm. "It already has. People are talking, Miles. They're paying attention. And that's how change starts." Miles nodded, her words settling over him like a warm blanket. For the first time, he allowed himself to feel a glimmer of hope. The fight wasn't over, but they had taken an important step forward. Together, they had shown that kindness wasn't a weakness, it was a force for change. The tension in the air was palpable as Miles entered the towering glass building of National Shipping Co.'s regional headquarters. It was the first time he'd returned since his firing, and every step felt heavy with the memories of that day. The conference room they ushered him into was far removed from the grittiness of the warehouse he once called home. Here, the polished wood tables gleamed under fluorescent lights, and the executives seated around them wore tailored suits that screamed authority. But as Miles scanned their faces, he saw something beyond the veneer of power: unease. These weren't people in control, they were people scrambling to contain the fallout of their mistakes. "Thank you for coming, Mr. Bennett," Sarah Klein, the head of HR, began, her tone measured but nervous. "We appreciate you taking the time to meet with us." Miles nodded but remained silent, his hands resting on the folder he'd brought with him. Inside were pages filled with notes, frustrations, ideas, and dreams, shared by the workers who had trusted him enough to speak candidly during the listening sessions he'd organized. Today, those voices would have their moment. "We've called this meeting to explore a way forward," Sarah continued. "Your story has brought attention to areas where we clearly need improvement. We want to discuss how we can address these issues while rebuilding trust." Miles leaned forward, his gaze steady. "Trust isn't built with words, Ms. Klein. It's built with actions. And right now, your workers don't trust you." Alan Reed, the COO, shifted in his seat, his lips pressing into a thin line. "That's exactly why we're here. We want to understand what needs to change." Miles opened the folder, pulling out a sheet of paper and laying it on the table. "Then start here." The room fell silent as they leaned in to read what he'd written. The list wasn't a collection of abstract ideas or corporate jargon. It was the stories of people who had suffered under a system that valued numbers over humanity. He didn't recite them mechanically. He brought them to life with his words. "Bethany Collins," he began, his voice firm. "She's been working in your warehouse for 6 years. When her father passed away, she requested a single day off for the funeral. Her supervisor denied it, saying it would disrupt productivity. She came to work anyway, tears running down her face while she moved your freight. That's who you're asking to trust you." The executive shifted uncomfortably, but Miles wasn't done. "Or take Carlos Perez. He works the night shift to support his 2 kids. He asked for a slight adjustment to his hours so he could pick them up from school. The answer? Number. He hasn't seen them awake on a weekday in 3 months." Sarah lowered her eyes, while Alan's jaw tightened. These weren't just statistics. They were people with lives, families, and struggles that had been ignored. "This isn't just about policies," Miles said, his voice softening but losing none of its weight. "It's about recognizing the humanity in the people who keep this company running." The conversation shifted after that. It was no longer about appeasing a public relations disaster, but about grappling with the real damage their practices had caused. Miles presented his proposal, not as a rigid list, but as a vision, weaving it into the fabric of the workers' experiences. "When I spoke with the employees," he explained, "the most common thing I heard was that they felt invisible. They want a seat at the table, not to run the company, but to be part of the decisions that affect their lives. A committee of their peers with real influence is a start." He glanced around the room, gauging their reactions. Sarah nodded thoughtfully, but Alan seemed skeptical. "And how do you propose we balance that with the demands of our business?" Miles met his gaze without flinching. "By understanding that the two aren't mutually exclusive. A worker who feels valued will always give you their best. But if you treat them like machines, don't be surprised when they break down." There was a pause before Alan leaned back in his chair, exhaling sharply. "What else?" Miles continued, describing how mental health resources, flexible scheduling, and opportunities for growth could transform the warehouse from a place of drudgery into a workplace people could take pride in. He didn't just talk about programs, he painted a picture of what it would feel like to work somewhere that cared, somewhere that prioritized people over quotas. As the meeting wrapped up, Sarah stood, her hand extended. "Thank you, Mr. Bennett. This gives us a lot to think about." Miles shook her hand, but held her gaze. "It's not enough to think about it. You need to act." Alan walked over, his expression unreadable. "We'll be in touch." As Miles left the building, the weight of what he'd done settled over him. He hadn't sugarcoated anything, and he knew not all of them had liked what they heard. But he also knew that change wouldn't come from staying silent. It had to be demanded. The days following the meeting were quiet, almost too quiet. Miles kept himself busy with the coalition's ongoing efforts, but he couldn't shake the feeling of anticipation, the lingering question of whether national shipping would truly follow through. He sat in Anya's apartment one afternoon, helping her sort through inventory for her online store. It was a rare moment of calm, and the two worked in comfortable silence until Anya broke it. "So, what's next for you?" she asked, her hands deftly wrapping a delicate ceramic ornament in tissue paper. Miles sighed, leaning back against the couch. "I don't know. Part of me wonders if I'm wasting my time trying to change a company like National Shipping. But then I think about Bethany, Carlos, and everyone else still working there. If there's even a chance I can make things better for them, isn't it worth trying?" Anya nodded, her expression thoughtful. "It's not going to be easy. Change never is. But if anyone can push them to do better, it's you." The conversation was interrupted by the buzz of Miles's phone. He glanced at the screen and froze. It was Sarah Klein. Anya raised an eyebrow. "Well, are you going to answer?" Taking a deep breath, Miles accepted the call. "Hello? Mr. Bennett," Sarah's voice came through, steady but formal. "I'm calling to let you know that the board has reviewed your proposal. We'd like to move forward with the Compassionate Workplace Initiative, and we'd like you to oversee its implementation." Miles felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. And you're prepared to commit to everything we discussed: worker representation, wellness programs, community engagement, all of it? Yes, Sarah said. The board understands that meaningful change requires a comprehensive approach. We're ready to take that step, and we believe you're the right person to guide us. Miles closed his eyes for a moment, letting the weight of her words sink in. All right, he said finally. I'll do it. But this has to be real, Sarah. No half measures, no PR stunts. If I see any signs of that, I'm walking away. Understood, Sarah replied. We'll send over the details for the next steps. When the call ended, Miles set the phone down and looked at Anya, who was watching him with a small smile. Looks like I'm back in, he said, his tone a mix of determination and uncertainty. You're doing the right thing, Anya said, and I'll be here to make sure you don't forget it. The first phase of the initiative began with the formation of the Worker Representation Committee. Miles returned to the warehouse to oversee the process, a task that felt both familiar and surreal. It had been months since he'd last walked those aisles, but the faces that greeted him were the same, some wary, others cautiously hopeful. Bethany was among the first to approach him. So, they're actually letting you do this? She asked, her tone incredulous but tinged with excitement. Miles smiled. Looks like it, but I can't do it alone. That's why I need you. Me? Bethany blinked. What do you mean? I want you on the committee, Miles said. You've been here long enough to know what needs to change, and people trust you. Bethany hesitated, then nodded. All right, let's do this. Over the next few weeks, Miles worked closely with the committee to identify immediate priorities. They held listening sessions, giving workers a safe space to share their experiences and ideas. Miles was struck by the honesty and vulnerability of their stories. Moments of frustration, exhaustion, and resilience that painted a vivid picture of life in the warehouse. I just want to feel like I matter, one worker said quietly during a session. Like, I'm more than just a cog in the machine. You do matter, Miles replied, his voice steady, and we're going to make sure the company sees that. As the committee gained momentum, Miles turned his attention to the wellness programs. He pushed for resources that addressed not only physical well-being, but also mental health, something that had long been overlooked in the warehouse environment. With the company's backing, they brought in counselors and began offering workshops on stress management and work-life balance. The changes didn't happen overnight, but the impact was undeniable. Workers who had once kept their heads down began to speak up, their confidence growing as they saw tangible proof that their voices mattered. Bethany, now one of the most vocal members of the committee, pulled Miles aside one day after a particularly productive meeting. You know, I didn't think any of this would actually happen, she admitted, but it's starting to feel real. Miles smiled. That's because it is, and it's only the beginning. The next hurdle was addressing the role of supervisors like Reed, whose toxic management style had been a root cause of so many issues. Miles worked with Sarah and Alan to develop a training program focused on leadership and empathy, ensuring that managers were held to the same standards of accountability as their teams. It's not enough to tell them to be better, Miles said during a planning session. We need to show them how and give them the tools to succeed. The program was met with skepticism at first, but as it rolled out, even the most resistant supervisors began to see the value in fostering a more supportive environment. For the first time in years, the warehouse began to feel less like a battleground and more like a community. One afternoon, as Miles walked through the warehouse, he paused to watch a group of workers unloading a shipment. Their movements were efficient, but there was an ease to their interactions that hadn't been there before. Laughter echoed faintly across the space, and for a moment, Miles allowed himself to feel the weight of progress. Bethany approached him, a clipboard in hand. They're saying productivity's actually up since the changes started, she said with a grin. Looks like kindness doesn't hurt the bottom line after all, Miles chuckled. Who would have thought? As he continued his walk, a sense of quiet pride settled over him. There was still work to be done, but for the first time, he could see the pieces coming together. The warehouse was changing, and so was the company. And though the journey had been long and fraught with challenges, it was proof that even the smallest acts of kindness could spark something far greater. The turning point came during a quarterly meeting where the results of the initial phase of the Compassionate Workplace Initiative were presented to the company's board of directors. Miles stood at the front of the room, flanked by Bethany and Anya, both of whom had become instrumental in bringing the program to life. The room was filled with a mix of skepticism and cautious optimism as executives, supervisors, and employees gathered to hear the update. Bethany was the first to speak, sharing her personal experience as both a worker and now a member of the Employee Representation Committee. "For years, I felt like I didn't have a voice," she said, her tone steady but heartfelt. "But now, I know that what I say matters, and that's made all the difference, not just for me, but for everyone in the warehouse." Next, Anya stepped forward, presenting data that showed a significant improvement in worker satisfaction, morale, and even productivity since the initiative began. "What we've learned is that investing in people doesn't just feel good, it works. Happier employees mean better results, and that's a win for everyone." Finally, it was Miles's turn. He looked around the room, taking in the faces of those who had doubted him and those who had stood by him. "This isn't the end of the journey," he said, his voice calm but firm. "It's the beginning. We've seen what's possible when we treat people with respect and compassion. Now it's up to all of us to keep building on that foundation." The applause that followed was tentative at first, but soon grew into a genuine show of support. Miles caught Alan Reed's eye and saw the faintest nod of approval. It was a small gesture, but it carried weight. In the weeks that followed, the company began rolling out the next phase of the initiative, expanding its reach beyond the warehouse. Supervisors across all departments underwent training on leadership and empathy, and the wellness programs were extended to office staff and delivery drivers. Miles found himself busier than ever, balancing his role as an advisor with his ongoing efforts to stay connected to the workers on the ground. One afternoon, as he walked through the warehouse, he spotted Carlos Perez, the night shift worker who had once confided in him about his struggles to balance work and family. Carlos was laughing with a group of coworkers as they unloaded a truck, his movements quick and confident. Miles approached him, clapping him on the shoulder. "How's it going, Carlos?" Carlos grinned. "Better than ever. You know, my schedule change finally went through. I get to pick up my kids from school now. Haven't missed a single day this week." Miles felt a swell of pride. "That's what I like to hear." As he continued his walk, Miles realized that moments like this were the true measure of success. It wasn't about policies or numbers. It was about the lives they had touched and the hope they had restored. The final piece of the puzzle came in the form of a public acknowledgement. At a press conference held to announce the company's transformation, Sarah Klein stood at the podium, flanked by Miles, Bethany, and other key figures from the initiative. "We made mistakes," Sarah said, her voice steady but emotional. "But we've learned from them. Thanks to the efforts of people like Miles Bennett, we've been able to turn those mistakes into opportunities for growth. Today, we're proud to unveil the Compassionate Workplace Initiative as a model for how businesses can prioritize both people and productivity." Miles stepped forward next, addressing the crowd with a mix of humility and determination. "This isn't about one company or one story," he said. "It's about creating a culture where kindness is valued as much as efficiency. We still have a long way to go, but if we can inspire even one other company to follow this path, then it's all been worth it." The press conference ended with a standing ovation, but for Miles, the real reward came later when Anya pulled him aside. "You did it," she said, her eyes shining with pride. "You proved that change is possible." Miles smiled, his heart full. "We did it," he corrected. "None of this would have happened without you." As the months passed, the ripple effects of the initiative began to spread. Other companies reached out to national shipping for guidance, eager to implement similar programs. Miles found himself traveling to conferences and workshops, sharing the lessons he had learned and the stories that had inspired him. At one such event, he was approached by a woman in her 40s, her expression a mix of gratitude and awe. "I just wanted to thank you," she said. "I used to work at a place like your warehouse. Hearing your story gave me the courage to speak up about the way we were treated. Things are starting to change now." Miles shook her hand, feeling a familiar warmth in his chest. "That's what this is all about," he said, "one step at a time." The warehouse, once a place of tension and frustration, had become a community. Workers laughed and supported one another. Supervisors led with empathy, and the company itself had begun to see the value in fostering a culture of care. Miles often walked those same aisles, reflecting on how far they had come and how much further they could still go. On one such walk, Bethany caught up to him, a clipboard in hand. "Got a minute?" she asked, her tone teasing. "For you?" "Always," Miles replied with a grin. She handed him a small card, its edges slightly worn. "The workers wanted you to have this." Miles opened it to find a handwritten note signed by dozens of employees. The words were simple, but powerful. "Thank you for reminding us what matters." For a moment, Miles couldn't speak. He simply nodded, his throat tight with emotion. Bethany patted his shoulder. "You've made a difference, Miles. Don't ever forget that." As she walked away, Miles stood alone in the quiet of the warehouse, holding the card close. The journey had been long and filled with challenges, but in that moment, he knew it had all been worth it. This wasn't just a job or a movement. It was a legacy, and it was only the beginning. The air was crisp on the morning of the company's first annual Employee Appreciation Day. A large tent had been erected outside the warehouse, filled with tables adorned with banners and photos, celebrating the workers who had brought National Shipping Company to life. Miles stood at the edge of the crowd, watching as families mingled. Children laughed, and employees shared stories over plates of catered food. It was a scene he could have hardly imagined just a year ago. Bethany waved him over to a table where Carlos and several other workers were seated. "Don't just stand there, Mr. Big Shot. Come join us," she teased. Miles grinned, making his way over. As he sat, Carlos leaned forward, his voice low. "You see what you did, Miles? This is because of you." Miles shook his head, his smile modest. "It's because of all of us. I might have lit the match, but it's everyone here who kept the fire going." They clinked their glasses in agreement, but Miles couldn't ignore the wave of pride and gratitude that surged through him. This moment wasn't just a celebration, it was proof of what they had accomplished together. Later that afternoon, the crowd gathered for the event's main highlight, the unveiling of a new plaque outside the warehouse. Miles stood next to Anya and Bethany as Sarah Klein took the microphone, her voice steady and warm. "Today we celebrate not only the incredible efforts of our employees, but also the transformation that has brought us here," Sarah said. "This plaque is a symbol of our commitment to the values that guide us: kindness, community, and compassion." As she stepped aside, Miles was invited to speak. He hesitated for a moment, feeling the weight of the moment. Then, taking a deep breath, he stepped up to the podium. "A little over a year ago," he began, "I was standing right here, in this warehouse, wondering if I'd made the biggest mistake of my life. I'd chosen to help someone, knowing it might cost me my job. And it did." He paused, scanning the crowd. "But what I didn't realize then was that losing my job would give me something much greater. A chance to fight for what I believed in, to stand up for the people who make this company what it is." The crowd was silent, hanging on his every word. This transformation isn't just about policies or programs. It's about people like Bethany, who refused to give up when things got hard. People like Carlos, who kept going for his family, and people like all of you, who believed that we could do better. Miles stepped back, gesturing to the plaque, which read, "In honor of the workers who remind us every day that compassion is the heart of success." The applause was thunderous, echoing across the lot as Miles felt tears prick his eyes. Anya squeezed his arm, her smile radiant. "You earned this," she whispered. The story of National Shipping Cobra's transformation spread far beyond the warehouse. Miles found himself invited to speak at conferences, universities, and even on national television. Each time, he shared the same message. Kindness isn't a weakness, it's a strength. One particularly memorable evening, he stood before a packed auditorium, his voice steady, but filled with emotion. "Every act of compassion sends out ripples," he told the crowd. "What starts as a single moment, a helping hand, a kind word, can grow into something that changes lives, businesses, even communities." As he finished, the audience rose to their feet, the sound of their applause filling the space. But for Miles, the true reward came afterward, when a young woman approached him, her eyes glistening with tears. "I just wanted to say thank you," she said, her voice trembling. "I used to work for a company that treated us like we didn't matter. But after hearing your story, I found the courage to stand up for myself. And now, things are starting to change." Miles clasped her hand, his heart full. "That's why we do this," he said softly. "Because no one should ever feel invisible." Back in his hometown, Miles's life settled into a new rhythm. He continued his work with National Shipping and the Compassionate Workplace Initiative, but made sure to carve out time for himself and the people who had stood by him through everything. One evening, as he and Anya sat on her porch watching the sunset, she turned to him, her expression contemplative. "You know, you never asked me what was in that box you helped me with that day." Miles smiled. "I figured if you wanted me to know, you'd tell me." Anya reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, intricately carved wooden frame. Inside was a faded photo of a man in a military uniform, his expression kind and familiar. "This is my husband," she said quietly. "That box had some of his things, letters, medals, little pieces of our life together. After he passed, I didn't know how I'd keep going. But that day, when you helped me, it felt like someone was telling me I wasn't alone anymore." Miles stared at the photo, his throat tightening. "Anya, I had no idea." She smiled, her eyes glistening. "You didn't need to. You just did what was right. And that's why I knew I could trust you to make this happen." The sun dipped below the horizon, casting the world in shades of gold and purple. Miles leaned back, his heart filled with a quiet peace. In the end, his journey wasn't about changing a company or starting a movement. It was about people, about seeing their struggles, standing by their side, and reminding them of their worth. It was about the simple truth his mother had taught him long ago. Doing the right thing might not always be easy, but it was always worth it. And as he sat there, surrounded by the warmth of friendship and the promise of a better tomorrow, Miles knew that his story was far from over. The ripples of kindness he had sent out into the world would continue to grow, touching lives in ways he could never predict. Because compassion, once ignited, never truly fades. It only spreads, lighting the way for those who come after. As Miles walked away from the warehouse, he reflected on how one small act of kindness had grown into something much bigger. It wasn't just about him, it was about everyone who believed that compassion could spark real change. What about you? Have you ever seen how a simple act of kindness can create a ripple effect? Share your thoughts or stories in the comments. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories like this one. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.